This is Jordan Poyer, safety for the Buffalo Bills, and you are now listening to Cover One Buffalo Podcast. Let's go.
Good evening and welcome to the Cover One Buffalo Podcast. You are joining your normal host, Greg Thompson, and tonight we are going to be going over an article that some of you had the joy of reading and giving me a wonderful hard time about. I went through an exercise to be able to kind of mess with what a dream offseason might look like. And dream is a relative term. You know, maybe it's a 14-year-old playing Madden, but when you're going to go through and do something that's passionate and over the top, I couldn't think of a person who is a better subject matter expert than passionate and over the top. My friend and host of the Rockpile Report, Drew Gier. Drew, how we doing, man?
Not too bad, not too bad. Yeah, over the top is kind of my brand. It's where we live. Yeah, you hit that one on the head.
So for everybody listening, I'm sure the vast majority of you guys are familiar, but Drew is the host of the Rockpile Report, one of the best and longest-standing Buffalo Bills podcast from the true perspective of a season ticket holder and someone living and breathing that experience every day and kind of talking through everything that goes through from the analysis side to the fan perspective side and everything there. So I've been a longtime fan of your work, Drew, and had the chance to meet you a couple times in person. It's always been a great experience. So appreciate you giving us a couple minutes here tonight.
No, I appreciate you having me. It's funny, we've met a couple times, and my favorite story is how you looked at my wife after meeting me for the first time, and you just looked at her and you're like, it's not a character. It's not a bit. He is this maniac that he sounds on his show.
I had convinced myself that it was a shtick. I had convinced myself that no one could just be like that all the time. And I want to tell everyone out there who listens, who tells themselves that when you listen to the podcast, he's real. He's like that all the time. It's real. So no, you're a great time, man. It was an awesome chance to meet you. And like I said, I've enjoyed the show for a long time and love being able to go back and forth. And it's kind of funny. It's come up on a couple other shows recently about the idea of competitiveness in the podcast and content marketplace. And I think people would get a kick out of how many of us talk all the time, nearly every day. Like it's
a
just,
lot of what you find is there's a lot of inclusiveness. There really is. Ultimately, I get it. Some people try to do this for profit. Some people just like my producer and I, we do it for kicks. We haven't monetized our show despite how long we've been around, how much traction we've gotten, simply because for me, it's a lark. I get my kicks out of this. It's my therapy. You know, you have Sunday, I sober up Sunday night. Monday, I blow off a little steam. I do some research. And by Tuesday, I'm finally ready to talk about the game without yelling, which still sometimes happens. But so with that, there's so many new content creators out there. And I think one of the things that you can lose sight of is that this isn't a competition. Yeah. You know, comedians talk about it. It's called famine mentality. And it was a big thing in the comedy scene for years where every comedian felt like they were against every other comedian for eyeballs or for market share. When in reality, when everybody gets along and there's inclusiveness, what you end up with is better products across the board.
Yeah. No, I agree completely. And I think that the fact that we're so fortunate to have, Bills Mafia as a whole is such a voracious appetite for good content. And then, don't get me wrong, I realize that sometimes introducing additional voices and additional people, if they're successful, there is some point of saturation, I guess, but I don't think we're anywhere near that. And I think that the more that's there, you get ideas, you're pushed for improvement, and the people who actually, like you said, Karen, I think people would be underestimating how many of us have a real day job and then do this for fun, that, we care enough to do this. We're not doing this because it's making us rich or that you're making any money off of it. You're doing it because we're passionate about what we do and we want to be able to talk about it. And, getting that response from different people who, seem to be interested in what we say is what drives us. So as long as people are willing to put in that work and be informed on what's going on and put out a quality product, I think that it's great for everyone to be able to do that. And I love being able to do things like this, to have people that I respect to come in and now give me a hard time about something I put together because I'm interested in what you say.
Oh, well, then I hope you're ready. I hope you're ready.
All right. So first, I'm going to lay out a couple different things. For anyone who didn't have a chance, I'll have it in the show notes here. But I had some fun going through what initially started out as all the insane things that get tweeted at me of, man, we should go out and do this and we should get that. And I'm like, all right, you want to know what? I'm not only going to figure out how to do it, I'm going to figure out how to do all of it in the same offseason. So I did set out some ground rules here. Obviously, I'm not having Chase Young fall to pick 22 or Jerry Jeudy as a third-round pick. We're not signing Chris Jones for $2 million. I tried to keep everything in the realm of possibility. I got a little, fast and loose with some of the things here and there, but overall, they're all within the realm of possibility individually. And that, all together at once is obscene. A couple of the rules I used, I assume that the new CBA was agreed to. So some of the things with extensions for our core pillar players would throw all of this out the window anyways. I'm hoping that's not the case, but we'll find that out. For anybody listening now, that sounds like it's going to be all the votes are due back from the players next Thursday night, the 12th. So by Friday, we should find out the vote. If it were to pass, all of those things would be into effect for the new league year with the legal tampering period starting on the 16th. So I'm going forward with the policy of that. I certainly played a little fast and loose with the locker room culture and veteran in every room thing with some of the releases. We'll start with that piece. I spent every single dollar, which Brandon Beane's rightfully not going to do. I use the Spot Track free agent market value, which I think are a little low on some of the players and a little advantageous in the pricing. I did play by the rules that for any draft pick that I used, I saw it in a Draft Network mock draft machine posting. So there were some pretty lucky ones that fell into there. And obviously I had this written up beforehand, and I literally had it submitted and edited before A.J. Dillon and Chase Claypool did what they did at the combine. And I was like, no, screw it. I'm not changing it. I'm not taking it back now. The one other thing a couple people asked about, I had this fully done and written on Saturday. And on Sunday, ready to be posted Monday morning. On Sunday, the Bengals announced that they were franchise tagging A.J. Green. I had us signing A.J. Green as one of my moves in there, and I'm like, all right, people are going to rip that apart if I leave it. So I had to go back and rework like half of this to be able to make it work. So I'll identify a move or two that were kind of a last-minute inclusion. So we'll start out, obviously, the salary cap's where it is. I think some of the obvious ones are obviously going to exercise the exclusive rights deals on Levi Wallace, Robert Foster, Jason Kroom. Those guys are going to get invited to camp, and obviously Levi's going to make the team, and the other guys will be able to fight for it. I'm a little curious what they do with Isaiah McKenzie, but I'm assuming they do an original round tender. It's a little expensive, but it doesn't guarantee until later, but we'll get to that. So the first thing I did was maximizing salary cap space. I don't think any of them individually are out of the question, but obviously some locker room leaders where I released, Lee Smith and Patrick DeMarco and Andre Roberts coming off a Pro Bowl. I ended up cutting 7 players that netted an additional $27 million in salary cap. What were your thoughts on going that extreme?
Okay. First and foremost, you did a really good job covering all your bases. I want to applaud you for covering all of your bases when you wrote the introduction to your article. Because, man, I mean, just to lay this out, to preface this for the listeners, this article to me was a lot like the movie Napoleon Dynamite. It was. In the sense that the first time that I read it, I not only didn't understand it, I didn't understand how it was conceived, but by the end, I was just angry. I was just angry by the time I got to the end of it.
That's awesome.
But then in the same way Napoleon Dynamite exists, you go back and you revisit it a time or two, and you find that it's not as bad, and it actually becomes enjoyable once you start to get it.
I like it. It's my wheelhouse.
So when I take a look at what you did with the releases and the cuts, first of all, I don't know if there's a fan base or a front office that would be okay with just meat grinding all of the character guys and these glue guys that seem they exist, especially in a Sean McDermott world, to hold this roster together. When things go sideways, whether it's in a game or whether it's during a 2 or 3 game slide, those are the guys that he leans on to keep this locker room from imploding. And the fact that you got rid of them all, I think he'd have a heart attack if he was your head coach. I genuinely believe that. Not only that, but you got to think of the interpersonal relationships. I mean, Reed Ferguson, his wedding is in June. I'm pretty sure Corey Bojorquez is one of the guys standing up in his wedding. If you get rid of him, I don't know what his mindset's going to be like showing up for work every day.
It's a little awkward.
It's going to be awkward. So I don't know that that's going to be popular, especially with a lot of the specialists. I mean, how did you decide that they were expendable? Was it just cap considerations, or was it?
So I, obviously from an exercise standpoint, to be honest, if anyone was going to nitpick any of the moves that I made here, I actually think people went after, we'll get to the trades and some of the silly stuff later. People went after that. No one commented on the releases. And if anyone were to put, a gun to my head, this is the least realistic part of any of the moves that I went through, in that I was purely maximizing cap space, and I went through and looked at anyone who was a genuine material net savings. Like that, hey, if I release them, could I replace them either with an upgrade or reallocate that somewhere else with a rookie and simply utilize that money to pile it up? Whereas, I don't see, I would say and for anyone who obviously hasn't seen the piece, it's Trent Murphy, Tyler Kroft, Spencer Long, Lee Smith, Patrick DeMarco, Andre Roberts, TJ Yeldon. I don't know that any individual out of that list is an absolute lock for the roster, or that 100% of all of them are going to, but I'd bet an obscene amount of money that 5 or 6 out of those 7 are going to make the roster, and maybe 1 or 2 get released.
Well, I'll say this. So you're talking about releasing Trent Murphy. He's a guy who, I mean, to me, that's the most likely thing. This isn't even fantasy. This is probably very likely to happen. He gets a bad rap from fans, but he wasn't the least productive player on our team last year when you look at raw numbers. But when you see how streaky he was, you want more consistency out of the position, especially for what he's making. I mean, he's one of the more expensive players on the roster.
That's how I described it with a guy that we went back and forth with when this came out. Was some people get mad about guys who deserve to be cut and out of the league. Trent Murphy would be unemployed for like a week. He would get picked up for sure.
Someone would get him.
The part that we get frustrated with is he's probably a $4 or $5 million player that we're paying $9 million.
Exactly.
And that people have trouble getting over that, in that, we'd feel better about it, but it's not that he's not worth being on a roster.
Well, in that same vein, Spencer Long makes a lot of sense. Spencer Long is an absolute luxury.
Yes. A $4 million backup is a bonus.
That's what I'm saying. A guy who played 16 and a half snaps last year on offense, of the percentage of all the snaps, and he's just there soaking up $4 million worth of cap space. That's an easy one. The point of contention, if I'm going to freak out about any of this, it's the tight ends. And I have the same conversation with my producer. Chris is a guy who doesn't really understand the X's and O's of football. Now, this is something he brought up to me during the Greg Olsen heydays, which I'm glad are over. Oh my God, go get Greg Olsen. You're talking about adding one of the oldest players in the league at his position. But the tight end group, Kroft, it's hard because when I look at the tight ends in free agency, I know in your chart you have us signing Eric Ebron. I look at Eric Ebron and I say, okay, his best season, his most productive season came when he was used heavily in the red zone with a very accurate quarterback. I mean, that's where he wasn't a 1,000-yard guy. He was a guy who scored a lot of touchdowns, had a couple big plays, generated some decent yardage. But when you look at it on its face, I'm not going to say Kroft is better than him, but I wouldn't say that Ebron is a far and away home run of an upgrade over Kroft when you look at durability and the way you would have to use him. So for your money, I don't know, if it's $1 million difference between what Kroft's making or $2 million between him and Ebron. That's just shuffling deck chairs to me.
Yeah.
And I know people get frustrated by that. I also don't like anybody who would come in here and take away snaps from Dawson Knox. Now, this past week on our podcast, I had Matt Perino in studio. We were talking about position groups the team could address in free agency. I told him I hated everything about this year's free agent class at tight end. Everything about him.
So the comment I made earlier, Ebron was my last minute plug-in when I lost AJ Green because I didn't really have anyone. I debated on trying to swing a third trade for David Njoku from Cleveland, but I already had 2 outlandish trades in there, so I'm like, if I go crazy with that, I'm going to really go overboard here. So yeah, that's where I struggled the most was is there somebody worth it? And to be honest, not only the free agent class, I don't love the draft class either. It's okay.
No.
There's a couple okay names, but there's not anyone that excites me at tight end.
And so I said that, and Matt Perino said, because I told him, I don't want anything cutting into Dawson Knox's development. I mean, he was a raw prospect when you brought him in. So what do you need when you're raw? You need reps. You can't just give up on the kid now. Yes, he struggled. He had his drop percentage was 20% last season. Yeah. He needs time. He needs reps. And to that, Matt said he would love to be in the stands with me when the Bills lose a game on the last drive of it because they're down by 4 and Dawson Knox drops the football. And it's like, why are you going to put that evil on me, man? Come on now.
He's like, not wrong. He's not wrong, but yeah.
Not even why would you do that to me? Why would you do that to the people 100 feet in any given direction from me? They didn't do anything to you. But so the tight end moves, that and the release of Lee Smith, I think the thing, you want to talk about not understanding X's and O's, my producer firmly believes, until I've taken him to school on it, that tight ends are tight ends are tight ends.
Yeah.
And I tried to explain to him that the thing that frustrates, I mean, I get it. People don't like Lee Smith between his untimely penalties.
Yeah, the penalties were legit, but they actually went away in the second half of the season.
They did. And the other thing I didn't like about him was that he seemed to be firmly tied to the hip with Frank Gore in terms of usage. Whenever Frank Gore was on the field, Lee Smith was on the field. And odds are it was a run to Lee Smith's side. And it just became this annoying tipping of the hand that good defensive coordinators are going to pick up on over the course of the year. And I think that played a role in some of the decline that you saw in Frank Gore's numbers because we never really deviated from it even on into the playoff game where finally they just stopped using the two of them in conjunction. But so with that said, I don't know that I would trust. I mean, if you think you're a contender and that's why you're doing this outlandish restructuring of the roster, you're not going to turn over primary blocking duties on the edges of your offensive line to a second-year player who struggled in his first year and an injury-prone veteran and what a late-round draft pick from the previous year who couldn't make the roster. That would scare the hell out of me.
Yeah, out of all these names, I think Lee Smith is the firmest from a safety standpoint of being on the roster, and it was reinforced that when McDermott was asked about the leadership void of Lorenzo Alexander and of the presence in the locker room, the first name he spoke was Lee Smith. And that what a powerful presence he is in the locker room and how they lean on him and what an important presence he was for Dawson Knox. And I think Tyler Kroft also got some props in other areas about, injured players that kind of sulk and go off on their own and how he stayed very engaged with both Knox and Sweeney. So I anticipate Lee Smith being on the roster in reality. And I think Tyler Kroft is very much going to get the full offseason, full training camp to show, can he build chemistry? Can he stay healthy? If he were to get dinged up again and show that he's just not going to be consistently available, I think that he's in a similar spot to Trent Murphy where he deserves to be on a roster. He'll probably get picked up by someone, but that price tag that's hanging along with it is enough that they may move on and be able to do that. But I think he's going to I don't anticipate a lot of proactive releases of anyone that's there. But again, in my dream exercise, I needed the money to go spend it elsewhere.
Now, before we shift gears and start talking about the players you wanted to sign, there's one last guy I want to pick your brain about here because you want to talk about conflict. There's ideas when you hear them for the first time, you go, that's crazy. That's nonsense. And you move on, which honestly, the first time through this, I was like, I shook the monitor a few times. I was like, what the hell is he talking about? Isaiah McKenzie is a restricted free agent for a 5th-round draft pick. I struggled with it the first time around because when you look at the pros of having McKenzie on this roster, he's a cost-controlled asset, which you can never have enough of in the NFL. You just can't. He's got special teams utility, which we all know Sean McDermott has an absolute hard-on for. He cut Jonathan Williams, who was a recent 5th-round draft pick of the team. From day one, he was just like, okay, if you're a backup running back who doesn't play special teams, then I don't need you. I can go find anybody who can do that. And the thing I liked about him was that even though his role was small in the the grand scheme of the team's operation, his role on offense of forcing defenses to having to play horizontally and not just defend vertically whenever he's on the field, that's valuable. And I think that that's not something that's easily replaced. You need a quick twitch guy. I mean, his yards before catch per reception was just 1.8 on the season, but he was third on the team in yards after the catch. He was one of the few guys on this roster that you could get the ball short to, and he could create something. Yeah. Now, I get it. He's small. He doesn't have explosive play. He's not Tyreek Hill.
Yeah.
And he didn't score. I mean, he had one touchdown in the season. So in the red zone where you'd think a guy like that would be most valuable, he didn't really produce a whole lot. So I could see it. It would just be hard for me agreeing with that. I mean, are you anti-Isaiah McKenzie at this point, or?
So I would say if you stack up the back end receivers on the roster, assuming that Cole Beasley and John Brown are locks, that Andre Roberts is very dependent on whether any of the picks are a KJ Hamler, Brandon Ayuk style. If they don't pick a top end returner, I'm going to assume Andre Roberts is back. So then you're turning into, I'm guessing we're adding 2, maybe 3 receivers in this offseason. So then you get into, depending on who that is, if it's a signing, if it's a 1 draft pick or 2, that it's Isaiah McKenzie versus Duke Williams versus Robert Foster. I think that Foster showed special teams ability. I think Duke Williams, in very small flashes had some potential. And then I think McKenzie is the most useful from a game day standpoint, but is also the most replaceable in that the vast majority. So he's going to be very interested in draft night, because if the draft pick is Denzel Mims, is T. Higgins, is Michael Pittman Jr., he's going to feel really good. If the draft pick is Henry Ruggs, Laviska Shenault, KJ Hamler, Brandon Ayuk, he's going to need to feel real nervous, because if they invest in one of those quick twitch early receivers in the first round, all those jet sweeps are going to go to that rookie. All those pop passes are going to go to that rookie. And the things that he does well, that was kind of my sales pitch before a lot of the injury stuff came up, was, hey, imagine if you had the guy who was as athletic as Isaiah McKenzie, but instead was 6'1", 225, you have Laviska Shenault. And that, having that opportunity. So I think that he's very much dependent on the skill set of where the higher end investment. I don't expect us to sign a top end receiver, but if we add someone, I've thrown out that ballpark of Tajay Sharp, Geronimo Allison, Rashard Higgins, Demarcus Robinson, like that, coming off a rookie deal, but relatively cheap still. Sign someone like that, and then I think we're going to see 2 draft picks. So I'd be happy if he made it, because his skill set is needed. But I think he could be upgraded by someone who can do his skill set and more.
See, now I've taken some heat from some of our listeners, because last night during our show, Tuesday night, when we broke down the various draft classes and their makeup, wide receiver is another one I really don't like a whole lot of what's out there. I don't. We tiered it. There's a lot of old. The average age of the wide receiver free agent class is a mess. You're talking about old guys without a lot of production. The guys who did produce the most aren't guys that are reliable. And they're not anybody you'd make any significant investment in. So what you're left with is a group of dart throws. It's an ugly place to be as a team trying to remake a roster. I don't think free agency is something you can depend on. Yeah, and that's kind of to the point of why I'd almost feel bad losing a player like McKenzie, just because he's at least a known quantity. You could look at a guy of a similar skill set, and I'm picturing like a Pharaoh Cooper, someone in that vein.
Tavon Austin.
But the problem with those guys is they're going to cost you more than McKenzie anyway.
Yeah, McKenzie for $2 million is better than Tavon Austin for $5 million.
Thank you.
For sure.
So as I'm looking at the rest of these signings you made, I've got some. You want to talk about bones to pick? Why do you like Brian Bulaga so much? What is it about this guy that you've mentioned him before when we've talked? Every time we've had a conversation about right tackle, it's almost like you find a way to slip it into the conversation. Like eventually, subliminally, you'll convince me this is a good idea.
So obviously, I think there's something about like when you're in college and there's that girl that you went after a couple times and you got shot down, and then you convince yourself that it's because she was really, really desirable and not because you just weren't able to close the deal. So I wanted Brian Bulaga in the 2011 draft and not CJ Spiller when we already had Fred Jackson and Marshawn Lynch. I wanted Brian Bulaga when he came and visited in 2015, and we were going to sign him, and he ended up going back. And at the time, he picked Aaron Rodgers over Tyrod Taylor. I can't be mad at the man. But
when you say it like that, that's not when you think about it in those terms, that's just hurtful, Greg. Why are you doing that? Why you got to do that to us?
Because some people put it out there like, oh, he used the Bills for leverage to be able to get more money out of the Packers. I was like, maybe, but did you look at they were coming off an NFC Championship game with Aaron Rodgers coming off a 48 touchdown season. It wasn't a real hard sell. So again, I think it's more so that I think he fits the window of where I like some of the signings that we can do shorter term before some of these big money extensions come up. I think we have a 2-year window, maybe 3, depending on the structure, where, we've got 2 more years of Trey before it really gets big. We've got 3 more years before Tremaine and Josh get big. And that some of these picks, you could pair Brian Bulaga with a Ezra Cleveland out of Boise State and be like, hey, you go watch him for a while. Bulaga's first 2 years of the deal go through, and then we get to choose whether the third year happens or not, and he can come along. And I also get a little bit nervous about some people really like the draft class. And if we have a chance of one of the top 4 tackles, you get a Tristan Wirfs, you get a Jedrick Wills, that's exciting. But I'm assuming those guys aren't going to be there, and that I don't want to roll the dice that we have the deepest roster in 25 years and everything that's coming together before these extensions happen, and we're going to just roll the dice that a rookie at right tackle is going to make it work. I like the idea that I've always thought Cody Ford should be a guard and could be an all-pro level guard, and that we plug and play a guy who's ready game one on the right side and then work on the development afterwards. So he's, I don't want to go spend what it's going to take for Jack Conklin. I don't know that there's another guy that's fantastic that's out there. You're talking about, are you going to ask Jason Peters to flip sides? Are you going to trade for Trent Williams?
Jason
Peters,
the other
nonsense.
Jason Peters, I've already seen people float that idea.
Oh, it's crazy.
Jason Peters back to Buffalo. Sure. That's what. First of all, I don't know that he'd ever put on a Bills jersey again.
No.
I don't know that I'd ever want to see that again.
Yeah, people throw it out with Marcel Darius. People throw it out with Sammy Watkins. And for whatever, for the talent or not, those guys are not interested in coming back to new ownership, new leadership, new GM, new head coach, all aside, playoff team all aside. Those are not gentlemen who are interested in reliving that experience. I feel confident in that.
So talking about the tackle position is interesting because, to your point, there's a lot of options out here to get short-term deals done.
Yeah.
The tackles are old, but that's kind of good because eventually you mentioned Jack Conklin. Him and Jermaine Iafetti are pretty much going to cause a bidding war. Yeah. Any team that wants a long-term plug-and-play, like, what do you want to call it? You want to say he's the solution to your problems for the next half a decade at the right tackle position. Those two guys would be it.
Yeah.
And essentially what you're going to do is you're going to pay a lot of money for those guys, but you're going to get a long-term value. If you're in the cap setup to do that, if you already have a quarterback figured out long-term and you've managed the rest of your roster to build towards that and you think you can afford the splurge, I don't think the Bills are there. You've got a quarterback who doesn't have a fair market value contract for quarterback play in the NFL. That's going to dictate short deals on anybody you want to swing for the fences on in terms of overall salary. What I don't like is I see you're talking about using Spotrack's numbers, and I see Bulaga, he's drawing about $10 million a year.
3 years, $30 million. I actually think that one's one of their more accurate ones. I do think that's about what he would cost.
So when I look over who's available out there, I just don't know. I think about a guy like a DeMar Dotson, who's a little bit older. He'd come in a little bit cheaper, and he would certainly be looking for a much shorter deal if that's the way you were going to do it. He would come in. He'd probably only want a 2-year deal because at 36, he may just hang it up.
Yeah.
And, you'd make it a 3-year deal, but you'd structure – because you know how, Bean loves to craft these things.
Yeah, he likes to have the out after the first year.
So he could potentially work some magic here to make a very team-friendly contract out of that. And then you've got some guys who, like Ty Nsekhe. He was a guy that we pegged as a fit for Buffalo. I was excited when we signed him. more so because then I can pat myself in the back and pretend that I still know things over here. But
it was a great call.
It was a great call because I'm cheap. You know what I mean? I'm cheap, and that's how I look at my free agents, and I say, okay, what can I get? And so you're talking about when you see what these guys are making, I just think that there's some flyers you could take a la Ty and Secchi. You know, Cam Irving?
Yeah.
From the Kansas City Chiefs is going to be out there. There's some other guys, you know, I think that Cameron Fleming, he's another guy kind of in his late 20s who has some upside. There's
the
some
name that I got a little surprised about the number I saw on Twitter today. I'm not even going to take a stab at his first name. I think it's Haloti Tai. Vaitai is his last name. He has literally a 15-letter first name. He's from American Samoa and is with the Eagles and has been the kind of luxury backup that they had with Jason Peters. He started playing more. They drafted Andre Dillard. Now they have Peters as a free agent. Rumors about Andre Dillard and Vaitai open up. And I thought Vaitai was going to be a little bit lower tier in the $5 or $6 million range. And now people were floating today $8 to $12 million. So because I was on board with Ifedi as well. But again, I thought Ifedi was more 5-6 year deal versus the 2 or 3 year deal. So yeah, I'd love to find one. Bulaga, again, I'm probably just harking back to wanting a name that I've wanted multiple times before. But I liked the idea, whether it's, you know, obviously we've joked about it in other settings that Bean or McDermott have traded up 6 times and traded down 0 times in 3 drafts. So I'm assuming that that's in play with where their history of trading down is pretty well found, or trading up is logical when you look at the tight ends drafted after Dawson Knox. Go look at the linebackers drafted after Tremaine Edmonds. Go look at, you know, the tackles drafted after Cody Ford. Their propensity for it is, hey, there's a tier of talent about to drop off here. We better get the last remaining guy. Well, all of a sudden you're in a draft where there's a firm top 3 receivers and a firm top 4 tackles. And then if one of those 7 guys start to slip to 16, 17, 18, 19, I could see Bean jump up to get one of those guys. And if they were to get Andrew Thomas, Jedrick Wills, Tristan Wirfs, I think that's there. The trouble is they're not going to know that in March when this happens.
Oh, absolutely. No.
So it's I think Nsekhe is a huge part of that, in that does he give them the flexibility that, say they don't get the free agent tackle they want, Ford and Nsekhe again is doable with the backup plan that, hey, if one of these top 4 tackles falls in our laps, we get to switch him over anyways. But then if you switch Ford over, did you re-sign Quentin Spain? I'm really curious how that domino works and whether they go free agent or draft. And that's why I kind of think they go free agent with one of the moves and then just work on the luxury of the draft if it happens.
Well, I'll give you Bulaga, and I'll say this. Prepare yourself now. This might be one of the last few nice things I have to say to you for a while here.
I'll take it.
Great minds think alike. In the sense that as I'm going through the rest of the signings, I'm seeing names. Wide receiver DeMarcus Robinson, defensive end Mario Addison, defensive tackle Vernon Butler. These are all guys that appear on the 17-page Word document that I sent my producer probably a little over a week ago, entitled The 2020 NFL Free Agency Draft, NFL Free Agency Manifesto. I make one every year. He tells me I'm a lunatic, and I tell him I like prep work. I'm also bored, and this year my wife is pregnant and she goes to sleep pretty early. So nice. I've got a lot of time at my disposal, and this is how I choose to spend it. I'm a sucker for good prep work. So with that said, all 3 of these names appear in my stuff, and it's essentially because I like the value to each of them. Every single one of these players, none of them's a household name, and they all have mitigating factors that should allow them to be signed for a reasonable price by comparison to production.
Yeah.
I think that's the thing. You're looking for value. These 3 players all represent it. You're talking about DeMarcus Robinson who got buried. I mean, you're on an offense that has Sammy Watkins is the 3rd option.
Oh, yeah.
He was the Bills' best wide receiver for years. So with that said, Mario Addison, he's kind of a wrecking crew at defensive end, and nobody talks about it.
It's 4 straight years of 9+ sacks.
Why? Why doesn't he get more shine by press anywhere? I mean, I'm assuming the Carolina folks love him, but I wouldn't know. You wouldn't know who he is. And then Vernon Butler, obviously there's a line to be drawn there because he's a Panther. He was a Panther who was drafted when Bean was in the front office and Sean McDermott was the defensive coordinator. And I think he's had a couple down years followed by a spike in production. That spike in production may inflate his price a little, but I think most GMs are – I don't know. We're going to see with Jordan Phillips. Jordan Phillips was a guy who had a similar season, albeit with more sacks.
Butler is very similar from a build standpoint and a style. A big defensive tackle who looks like a one tech, but is actually a three tech.
Yes. And so when you look at the way he plays, if he comes in, for my money, if I'm looking at a Jordan Phillips who probably pushes, I'll be interested to see what he gets. Defensive tackle salaries have been kind of repressed. Early on in the offseason, we did an exercise. Every season I track the fluctuation in average league spend at different positions of interest. Defensive tackles have seen the smallest uptick in salary since 2017 in terms of percentage. League-wide teams aren't really – there's not a lot of fluctuation there because there's only a handful of guys making a ton of money. Think about it. Jordan Phillips was making $4 million a year last season, and he was the 20th highest paid D tackle.
Wow.
So with that said, guys aren't making a lot of money there.
So you're going to have Fletcher Cox, Aaron Donald, Chris Jones, and then a big drop.
Exactly. And so once you get past that, you're talking about a guy, and you talk about Jordan Phillips setting the market. That's the big fear for Bills fans. I don't think he gets there.
Yeah.
But I'd say that if he gets anything north of $8 million, you'd probably have some incentive to go check with the camp of Vernon Butler and see what he wants. Because if he wants a $5 million Vernon Butler is worth more to me than an $8 million Jordan Phillips.
Agreed.
So your trades here. And this is where I'm going to refill my glass.
So as Drew goes through here, we'll start with the Arizona version. I messed around with, and people will see it again, I did it with the Alshon Jeffrey rumors that came out. I think that there's an inefficiency in the NFL of where teams that are bad at managing the cap are willing to compensate another team to basically lease their short-term salary cap space. And that if you're able to do that while getting an asset, whether that's an improvement in a draft pick or access to another player, which we'll get into in the second one, I think that's an interesting way to short-term use the cap, which then is on a one-year deal and you get back. So it's not common. You saw it most blatantly with the Brock Osweiler trade where the Browns got a second-round pick for absorbing his contract from the Broncos. So I kind of took that mindset. My first trade was Buffalo getting David Johnson from the Cardinals for Arizona's third-round pick in exchange for Buffalo's sixth, and then a conditional fifth-round pick in 2021. So we get an improvement in salary or in draft, moving up from the sixth to the third, and then absorbing his obscene contract, which is $10 million to be a, potentially, slot receiver / third running back, with the caveat that I think there's a non-zero chance that in the right situation you could get back closer to the guy that only 1 year ago had 1,400 yards and 10 touchdowns, even if that may not be realistic.
Okay, now this is where I'll start this off by prefacing. Remember when I said I'm a cheapskate? Yeah. Outside of booze and meat, I'm the type of guy that I'd make Ebenezer Scrooge feel a little embarrassed by just – it's bad. I spent 20 minutes the other day debating on whether or not to spend $25 on a belt. I was checking Amazon for 20 minutes just to see if I couldn't find it a little cheaper somewhere else. I'm bad. I'm a chiseler.
It's awesome. It's awesome.
So when I see the money –
10.2 is ugly. It is.
I see the money that right tackles and defensive tackles are getting paid. And it's for what would amount to a backup running back. I wince.
Yeah.
When I saw you say that you wanted to get past TJ Yeldon because you wanted to, I don't know. You said, to quote your article, I believe you said you wanted to get a bigger contribution. Is that it? Or what did you say? You wanted more production or a bigger potential out of your backup running back spot. I don't know. If you want to try to explain away the struggles of David Johnson, 2018, he played for the only offensive line in the league that was cheaper than the Buffalo Bills.
Yeah.
Okay, so, and they looked like it. They were the worst team in football. You look at Le'Veon Bell and what happened with him in the Jets this year, you could say that a bad offensive line. Look at what happened to LaShawn McCoy when he played that last season in 2018. Both of them had their career highest yards before contact. I mean, their lowest. And it sank their entire seasons. So you could take a good player and put him in a bad offensive line position, and it will kind of shrink things. 2019 rolls around. 2019 rolls around, and David Johnson gets his third offensive coordinator in 3 years. And he says, okay, new scheme. I'm going to try to get used to this. I'm going to try to adapt to it. And you could try to use that. You could say they Alex Smithed him. But at the same time, I look at a dozen local writers down there in Arizona. The USA Today's Kent Summers, who follows the team, the week before he was benched permanently for Kenyon Drake, said that David Johnson had all the suddenness and explosion of a minivan. And
he means that in the bad way?
Yeah, exactly. So I guess it's one of those things where I think to myself, some running backs just lose it.
Yeah.
It's a position where you're not guaranteed every single year that you're going to come back and be the player you were the year beforehand. Sean Alexander, for some of you out there who are a little bit older, he won the rushing title for the NFL. I think he set the record for single season touchdowns.
He did.
And then not only did LaDainian Tomlinson show up the next year and just completely wipe his record off the map, but he regressed to a point where less than 2 years later, he was completely out of the NFL.
Yeah.
I think of more recently Eddie Lacy, a guy who, when he first hit the NFL, was a little bit hungrier. He was a little bit younger. He was a little bit more explosive.
Literally hungrier.
Literally hungrier, because you saw it. He became a mini fridge with legs. And he was this tiny little, it was literally like you put muscular legs on a keg and then strapped a jersey on it.
Yeah.
But when you look at David Johnson, you have to ask the question, does he fit your need for a bigger threat running the ball at the backup running back position? Or are you paying $10 million just for the pick? And what you're going to end up with is Eddie Lacy 2.0.
Yeah. I think it's very fair. And it is certainly an outside shot. You're talking about going into the age 29 season. That's certainly a risk. And that, I think 2 straight seasons with 3.6 and 3.7 yards per carry. Obviously more of the value on the receiving side of things, 80 catches, 50 catches, 36 catches. Still having he's still 6'1", 224, has the body to be able to do it. So, I think it's valid to be able to question, is the risk of eating $10 million for a backup running back worth, a legitimate, day 2 pick, but also is there really any chance he's going to come through on that investment? So I think that's fair and is more theoretical in the idea of, is there a way we can eat that to be able to do it? And then if you took out his production, let's assume it was purely a financial transaction, you wouldn't pay $10 million for a 3rd round pick. It would be less than that, or that's more in line with what the Browns paid for the 2nd round pick for Osweiler, in that you would be banking on getting production to net out the value of the trade. And I think that's fair to question whether we'd get to that point.
So then the other trade that I did, this trade idea of, and this is a good one. This Yannick Ngakoue and Nick Foles trade. Now, this was something you floated early on in our conversations, probably about, 3-4 weeks ago?
Yeah, I put it out there almost a month ago.
And you started fleshing it out, and the more you started fleshing it out, the more interested I got. And I think out of anything from this point forward, this is an idea that not only fans could get behind, but, I mean, even if this wasn't just some theater of the mind fantasy exercise for your listeners, this is something that I think could make sense if you could find the right value. Yeah. I mean, tagging and trading pass rushers is in vogue lately. Yeah. It's a new trend in the NFL. D Fork, Frank Clark, and Jadeveon Clowney in the last 2 years, year?
Yep. All 3 of those were last year.
Okay. And it's hard to argue with the results for either side of the fence in those transactions.
All 3 players played really well, or played well
played for playoff teams. 2 of them played in the Super Bowl. And at the same time, the teams that got the draft capital in return needed it and seemed to have used it smartly. So it's one of those things where no one, when you look at those trades on their face, I mean, the Clowney thing is still up in the air, given that if they don't retain him, that becomes a little bit dicier in terms of you rented a guy for a first round pick. That would be rough. But on its face, it worked for everybody. So everybody here in Buffalo seems to like this idea of Ngakoue being on the Bills roster. And I like the idea. You know, one of the things that whenever you're talking about the offseason, you draft players because that's how you build successful teams. Brandon Beane seems to have a handle on that. When you go into free agency, I don't think it's so much about trying to get the biggest and the best name. It's about establishing a specific floor of production. You want to know what you can reasonably expect so that you're not surprised on Sundays when you don't have something. With Ngakoue, he gives you the best floor in terms of his pass rush. He's proven. He's done it year over year. He's been durable. He seems like, and you can move him around the defensive line. You can do different things with him in specialty packages. He's just a great piece. And then you look at bringing in Nick Foles. Now, I don't know what that big Nick energy would do for Josh Allen. I feel like
there's a non-zero chance for anyone who wanted to pick at something. I don't even know if it's Josh Allen directly as much as it is the guys in your section in the third game of the season, in the third quarter, when he throws his second interception, is everyone freaking chanting for Nick Foles. That's the only thing that gave me a point, because I actually think, I think Foles has, teetered on retirement. I think he's not sure what he wants to do with his future. I think that he's very devoutly and openly a man of faith. I think that he's curious about what he wants to do. I think there's a lot of things he'd fit into the locker room. I think he's genuinely better than Matt Barkley, if God forbid Josh Allen actually got hurt with the roster we're putting together. I think that Nick Foles is the kind of guy that, hey, the season might not be completely lost. I do have the slightest tinge of, if Josh doesn't take a step forward, starts a little bit slow, does he give enough of that, hey, the most popular guy in town is always the backup quarterback? Is that too much to be able to add there? But I think that there's an underlying or an underrated need that if we put this roster together, an improved backup quarterback is worthwhile.
Well, in this exercise, you're swinging for the fences anyway, so there is no tomorrow for you.
Yeah, that's a good point. I'm spending every dollar. Yeah, we're celebrating the parade and then crying because we can't afford any of these people the next year.
It doesn't matter. I mean, at this point, so if that's what you're looking for, you would like a backup quarterback of that caliber. You'd want it, because in a pinch, you need a guy. You need a guy, and you need a guy who you've seen go out there and do some stuff.
Literally come in as a backup and win the Super Bowl.
Even just to give the rest of the roster faith. So I understand that, and it works for me. Now, what I'm about to say might be the nerdiest thing that's ever come out of my mouth, and I got to kind of prepare myself for this. I just don't think that the mechanics of the trade you laid out, I don't think it's ever going to get it done. And here's why. You're talking about offering the 5th round pick we're getting back in exchange for losing Isaiah McKenzie. What I'm looking at, that's pick number 140. So when you look back at last year's draft pick value chart, that pick was worth 35.5 value points. If you figure each of the high-end defensive prospects that were traded, that we just talked about, D. Ford and Frank Clark, those are the 2 we're using because we know they signed extensions. So we know what the value and the actual outcome of that was. You got Ford with his 2nd round pick. He was the lowest at 540 points. It was a 2nd round pick. And then the highest being Frank Clark, because it was an amalgamation of multiple picks that ended up totaling 898 total value points. The average becomes 719. Now you're talking about the 2nd round pick that the Browns got for absorbing Osweiler's deal. You reference it in your article.
Yep.
That was worth 550 value points. So if you do some quick math, that would mean that if absorbing his contract would be around equivalent value, and we throw in the bonus 35.5 points, you're still woefully shy of what the average cost of an elite pass rusher trade is in the NFL. it's painfully skewed towards the Bills. And that would mean that we would have to do something additional to sweeten the pot, I think, for any team to entertain something like that.
Yeah, and that came up, and this is probably very advantageous to the Bills in the way that I initially structured it. Going back and forth with a couple people, I got it closer to one. I do think they would probably include Matt Barkley because they would still need a backup quarterback there. We would be there. That's, let's say that's equivalent to another fifth or sixth, a small late end pick, but some minimal value. I think there's some scenario where if we're looking at drafting a guy and adding someone of Ngakoue's caliber, I think there's some scenario where Daryl Johnson represents a little bit of value in doing that from what his potential was last year being on the roster. I think.
Oh, you mean the pterodactyl? Yeah, I'll tell you what his value is. They can attach some foam wings to him, and he can cool everyone down on the bench with his massive. I mean, the man is a human pterodactyl. I mean, it's amazing. It's also terrifying, and I don't know where he buys his shirts, but I'm interested.
So looking at that, I think that gets it a little bit closer. I think I put together if it was Daryl Johnson, Matt Barkley, and a 4th-round pick, it gets it closer to the ballpark. If you get up to where it's a 3rd-round pick or higher, I think you get into, okay, is that the right scenario if we're eating Foles $15 million, if we're giving up a day 2 pick and we're giving Ngakoue over $100 million, it gets a little bit tougher to check each of those boxes. But, in my mind, you laid out the exact points. If you're going to spend, I don't actually like the idea of ever splurging to that degree of Mario Williams is a perfect example. Mario Williams had 3 Pro Bowl seasons. One of them was an All-Pro season, 40 sacks in those 3 seasons, and he still never lived up to the contract that they laid out to him.
Well, so that's what happens when you make anybody the highest paid player at their position ever. They're never going to live up to it because you just set the bar. You set the bar as high as it ever has been. There are no players ever going to live up to it.
If you're going to do that, though,
but ultimately, that's what we're doing here.
Yes.
That's what we're doing here tonight. We are shooting for the fences. You are spending recklessly. You are like a teenage,
all the dollars.
You are a teenage girl at the mall with her dad's credit card. Damn the consequences. You'll deal with it tomorrow.
That is exactly accurate.
And I mean, this is one of those things where if this thing goes, I mean, it takes balls to put a plan like this together because in reality, if you were to do something like this, like Bill O'Brien, you look at what he's doing down there.
It's not terribly different than what the Rams have done the last 2 years.
And I'm shocked that Les Snead. I mean, I'll tell you this: never mind what you're planning here, even something is because this is far more egregious than what Les Snead has done.
Yes, yeah, this is
what Les Snead is doing. To me, is if I was an NFL owner and this was my GM and it went terribly sideways, we not only never won a Super Bowl, but you also wrecked me from a salary and draft perspective. You could, I mean, I could foresee that ending like Nicky Santoro in the movie Casino. Like that's not even, you're not just fired. You end up like Billy Bats. That's how this whole thing turns out.
Yeah, well, heck, they have their next 1st-round pick coming in like 2027, so they should be fine.
They won't be in LA anymore when they make that first draft. By the time they get around to drafting in the 1st round again, they won't even be in LA anymore.
Yeah. So the scenario that's out there, I think you've seen some other things that the Jags have put out there of guys who are available. They're trying to move Calais Campbell. They're trying to move Andrew Norwell. They're trying to salvage any value they can from Foles. I think that Ngakoue is obviously one of the guys you want to keep. You and I both laid out, never missed a game, premium position, consistent production. He's only 24 at the beginning of free agency. That's crazy. I think we looked at it. He's like 14 months older than Zach Bond, who people are excited about coming out in the draft here. He's about to be a free agent after 4 years in the NFL, and he's like 14 months older than Zach Bond. But that's the kind of guy, if you're going to splurge, you want a guy that checks every single one of those boxes to be able to do that. So I actually think it's by far the most likely Bean does not splurge with anyone. But if he does, it would be a guy that checks every single box like this.
Oh, of course. Okay, so the next phase of this conversation is about the draft. So you fleshed out all these things you would do with some elaborate trade scenarios that are very well thought out. Obviously, we can pick them apart, but hey,
sure, yeah, favorable
for
value
the fences,
in the
and I like where your head's at on that one because honestly, if I'm a GM, what would end up happening? It would be one of those things where I'd talk myself out of it. And then at 2 a.m., I'd get up and I'd just start frantically making phone calls to Jacksonville's GM. Can you do this for me? Just do it because I can't sleep at night. Your fourth phase of this was your draft and how you would use the draft to finish fleshing out the roster. Because in essence, you've spent all of the money except for our draft pool.
Yeah. Literally, I held only enough dollars to sign the draft pick. There is no other dollar. No one's allowed to get hurt because we can't replace anyone.
I hate mock drafts. You and I have gone back and forth about this, and you've given me some really pragmatic answers as to why I shouldn't just throw around terms like they have no value. Yeah. Because ultimately, this is all just a lark. All of this is the beauty is in the eye of the beholder. So mock drafts are entertainment to someone else. To me, I would rather eat glass and insulation than be subjected to a whole boatload of them the way we are every single offseason.
And to give fans some insight into the wonderful instant message DM pool that we have between a handful of different people, it's very rarely football. But on the occasions that it is, we talked about things like the draft where Drew is 100% right in that if people are using mock drafts as a benchmark of look at who I predicted, that's insane. One, if you hit any of those, it was blind luck. It was nothing that you knew or inside information on.
Our friends Michael Kist and Ben Solak from Bleeding Green Nation and the Draft Network, they do an exercise over at Bleeding Green Nation every year that I love. I revel in it. They work it like golf, and they take all of these national pundits' final mock drafts, and then they score them pick by pick based on where they thought this person would go and how far they fell comparatively. And you get handed a score. And Doug Farrar, he's been in the 400s, every single year. And every single year he puts out a mock draft anyway. He knows he's terrible at it, and he just keeps doing it. Which, hey, Godspeed, man.
If you're not going to be accurate, be confident. So the idea is, and my counter to Drew's very valid concern and issue with mock drafts is I think the exercise is worthwhile from, hey, what does it look like if you go receiver early in a deep draft where the drop-off at pass rusher and tackle might be more dramatic versus passing on the flashier name early, knowing you can get a guy later. I think doing that exercise over and over again helps form where the tiers drop off, where that happens, and makes more sense of, okay, if you're trying to play it in the way that Bean has in his history, where he very clearly cares about where drop-offs in talent tiers are. I think there's value in looking at, okay, now that I've done this 10 times, I get the idea that if you don't take a tackle in the first 2 or 3 rounds, you might as well not because none of them are going to matter. If you don't take a pass rusher in the first 3 rounds, you might as well not because it's not going to matter. No matter what we do, you can wait as long as humanly possible and still get 2 receivers that you somehow still like the names. It's just you start to see trends like that where, hey, if you're going to take – and then it gets to the point of you're not going to take – and obviously I was very fortunate to the Bills and that Henry Ruggs fell here. Let's assume that's not the case. Let's assume it's a situation where we like 2 players equally and it's Christian Fulton from LSU and Jordan Jefferson from LSU. I would say this exercise shows that, hey, I hope they go with Christian Fulton because I think the drop-off at corner is more dramatic than the drop-off at receiver, and the combination of corner early and later receiver is a better combo than wide receiver early and corner later.
And to your point, you're right, and you're the only person who's been able to talk me into this line of thinking. That no, seriously, you equated it once to me of doing a mock draft in fantasy football. You were like, look, doesn't it? If you repetition. You get reps in anything, and you become more. You get a better understanding of it. It's the same way.
Frame of reference. You build a frame of reference.
And also, I think part of my angst just comes from watching random teenagers on the internet out mock draft my actual team's GM year after year after year. Like that just became a grind. I hated it. Yeah. So with that, I just tried to ignore it all. Now, when I look at what you did here, I'm not mad. I'm just disappointed. And I'm going to start this off with asking, don't get me wrong, I'm an Alabama fan. I'm the only Alabama fan I feel like in Western New York.
That might be valid.
And I catch a lot of crap for it. Oh, my God, do I take heat for it. Because I started rooting for them before they started winning. A friend of mine, his whole family's in on it. He's uncles who went there. So I kind of get on the bandwagon, and then Nick Saban showed up, and they just took off. And everyone's like, oh, of course, that's the team you like. And I had to explain to him, I'm a Bills fan. What are you talking? Me a bandwagon?
There's no front running here.
There is no front runner. I'm used to rooting for losers. So with that said, I've watched a lot of football over the last few years of Alabama. I try to watch every game. If not, I go back and I watch the recaps. It's a tough thing for me to see Ruggs at 22. Not that he wouldn't fall there, but I don't know that I like him for what we're trying to accomplish with our wide receiver group. I know that he plays bigger than his frame. I know he's a quick twitch athlete. He's got playmaking upside that most NFL offenses, especially ones who like to run as much out of the shotgun as the Bills did last season. You're going to let Josh see the field and kind of pick and choose where his matchups are. Ruggs, I get it. He could provide value to him. But if you mean to tell me that Ruggs is there and there's still a bigger, more physical wide receiver who could help out not only in the passing game but the running game, because that's something you can't ignore. I feel like taking Ruggs over a bigger framed wide receiver would be like going, and you can understand where I'm coming from. It's like you went to a steakhouse. You went to a steakhouse and you ordered your favorite ribeye, because I know it's your favorite.
It is. And
they cooked it medium rare instead of rare. You're still going to eat it, but you know in the back of your head it could have been so much better.
No, I like it. I think that's fair in that it all depends on the tiers. It depends on and for many people, it really comes down to, is Ruggs the third player in the top tier or towards the top of the second tier? And it all depends on, do you draw the line after Ruggs or after Judy and Lamb? And it really comes down to, if you think he's special enough that he's separated from what I think is a tier of 8 or 10 guys that, pick your flavor. Do you like Denzel Mims? Do you like Brandon Ayuk? Do you like Jalen Reagor, T. Higgins, Laviska Shenault, any of those guys? I think that you have a big chunk of guys that are all flavor of the month, and you get into the value of the speed or the playmaking ability of Jalen Reagor versus the size and the high pointing of T. Higgins. If you think Ruggs is simply in that mix, then I understand that you get into, hey, Denzel Mims is the best blocking receiver in the draft, and he ran a 4.39. That's a pretty nice combo.
And that's where I guess, because if you're talking about, again, in the vein of your exercise here, you want more production out of your running game, and you know that you're bringing in a running back who's 200 and almost 30 pounds, and he's struggled. He's going to need some help if he's going to be effective. Wouldn't you want more physicality out of your wide receiver group? I mean, look at the impact that Robert Woods had on the Rams offense when they signed him. Todd Gurley was good, but he had his best seasons after Robert Woods got there to play the slot and manhandle people out of the box. I feel like a more physical presence at wide receiver could do more to also help our rushing attack, which I don't think Ruggs at 6 foot and less than 200 pounds. Again, his contact and his play and the way he plays through it and all those things are great, but you're not going to bully a 6'2" cornerback or a 6-foot cornerback who has you by 15 pounds off the line.
Yeah. Whereas Denzel Mims might be able to square up on an outside linebacker.
Thank you.
He may not be able to drive block him, but he may be able to get in the way to be able to do that.
Exactly.
Side note, as I do try to take my medicine when I make a horrible mistake. I was so wrong on the Robert Woods contract and made fun of Rams fans for overpaying him, and that was such a fantastic contract.
Oh no, we were talking about it during our show. He's been one of the best values in free agency. He's the pick that if you're going out into free agency, you don't want to be setting the market. What you want to do is go out and find yourself a Robert Woods.
Yeah.
Go find yourself a guy who he can run block. He's good for 800 to 900 yards. He's going to be durable. He's going to be reliable. That's the sweet spot right there.
Oh, and for as much as we missed on that, last year's version of that is John Brown. Like you talk about the amount you paid versus the value you got back. Bobby Woods is $8 million, John Brown's $9 million, but from a 3-year inflation standpoint, that's about right.
So now you want to talk about other things that you put in here in this draft that I just scratched my head.
Yep.
And this isn't even, I guess, a problem with your philosophy as it is. I wonder, because you said you did this before. You covered yourself by saying you set this draft up before the combine. Kyle Duggar. He's a guy that Bills fans who have been paying attention to the draft run-up know that the Bills have spent a considerable amount of time scouting for a kid who's not from a big college.
Yeah, from a D2 school. Yeah.
Which very much underscores interest. So with that said, you have him going to the 3rd round. When you were making this, was there anything that said maybe that's even too low then? Pre-combine, pre-everything, the 3rd's a little low? Again, I don't look at mock drafts. I try not to. They make my eyes bleed. So have you seen him routinely available in mock drafts that late? Or is this...
So the hard part is beforehand, he was consistently a 4th, 5th, and 6th round pick before the Senior Bowl. Then the Senior Bowl brought more light to it. Then he did really well at the Combine. And it really gets into that philosophy. And obviously I have 2 other Combine superstars on here with A.J. Dillon and Chase Claypool. And I try to warn people, and we get into it in our Slack channel all the time, in that guys don't go from graded out by film as a 5th round pick, oh, they looked awesome at the Combine, they're an early 2nd. That's just not like, don't get me wrong, Al Davis used to do it, but he's no longer with us. That doesn't happen as often as what people think in what's there. So, as Eric took a look at it, he grades him as a late 2nd, early 3rd round guy. A lot of other people I've talked about said he's a good player, but there's some tackling issues and some things in film that aren't there that everyone's going to convince themselves, oh, it was the D2 coaching. We can bring him aboard and make him right, and that his physical skills are there. But that there's a reason that he's not on par with Xavier McKinney coming out of Alabama or Isaiah Simmons when they're physically not that far off from each other from a talent or from a measurable standpoint. So, yes, I've seen people saying that he's a late 1st round pick. I think that's crazy. I think it's most likely that he's a 2nd round pick versus this was the earlier 3rd from Arizona. So it's, right at the tail end of the second round. But
everyone may love this guy, but if Budda Baker was a 2nd round pick, there's no way that this kid gets into that 1st round conversation because Budda Baker might have been one of the better prospects I've seen at safety in a while. Yeah, and the fact that I thought it was criminal when he didn't go in the late 1st round.
People now leapfrogging Antonio Winfield Jr. For Tugger. I think that he's a name that has a stronger resume from what's there. So, I think that early 3rd round is favorable, but not crazy. That's not a crazy thing. I think he is a 50 to 75 guy. I think he's going to go somewhere late 2nd, early 3rd. If that means the Bills at 54, I don't think that's crazy. I think that that's within reason. I would feel better. He's the kind of guy that I could see that talent tier shifting and that Bean says, hey, this is the last decent guy that's left here in this pool. We're going to move from pick 86 up to pick 70. Okay. I think I could see that happening.
Okay. So then, and you've got a lot of great stuff in here, different draft picks. You kind of fleshed out your logic behind them. And as I get to the end of this, I find myself, now I've gone through all of your draft picks in this article and we put it all together. And I find myself sitting here rubbing my temples, just going, holy running backs, Batman. What just happened? When you talked about getting rid of Yeldon, I was miffed, but I got over it. Okay. Then I read farther into it and I see that you're going to acquire David Johnson just to add some draft capital. And I say, okay, I guess you're going to add what could be talent. Maybe we're going to go fishing here. Okay. We've got a decent room now. You've got a Christian Wade. You've got
Sonoris Perry.
Sonoris.
I think if you look at the roster, it says RB next to his name technically.
I'm not going to lie to you. I would rather have Tyler Perry than Sonoris Perry at this point because I think he brings more value. I think he's a locker room guy. I think he could bring a lot of levity to the team. I think he could do a lot more for us than Sonoris does.
It's an interesting approach.
So, but when I look at this, I say, okay, David Johnson, I can grit my teeth. We're going to throw some bodies at this for camp, and we're going to move on. And then I watch you proceed to Al Davis me and double down on mid-round running backs. Why? Why are you doing?
All right, so one, obviously they wouldn't actually select. Two, in the fact that I cheated and put A.J. Dillon at fullback because he weighs 247 pounds. I actually don't have any evidence that A.J. Dillon is capable of playing NFL fullback, but at 247 pounds and he's in the backfield, I figured that could translate in this Madden scenario. So, that one is, probably a little flexible there. So out of all the things that are there, I do think that we add a running back. I don't think there's any scenario where we had three. That's obviously obscene. I do think so I'm torn. I think there are, depending on whether you think Dillon's real. I didn't really have Dillon on my radar. I knew of him. There are guys that I respect that were high on him as the season went. He doesn't really catch the ball. He's not very shifty, but he's big and fast and runs straight in a hard, aggressive manner. And then he kind of blew up at the combine from a size standpoint, and from a athletic comparison standpoint, his two closest comparisons were Ricky Williams and Nick Chubb. And I was like, oh, well, maybe I should pay more attention to this. So I don't know if I count him in this group, but there's a group of 6 running backs that I think have a chance to be on par or equal to Devin Singletary. I, like you, in reality, despite my exercise here, I hate paying running backs. I think it's the worst investment in football. I think you should draft the best available running back from the 3rd to 5th round every other year, forever and ever. Amen. Just keep doing it every other year. Cycle them through. If you accidentally hit on an Alvin Kamara, deal with that wonderful problem. But other than that, just keep cycling them through. So whichever guy out of, I don't expect DeAndre Swift, J.K. Dobbins, or Jonathan Taylor to actually fall to that point, but if one of them were to, and then you get into Clyde Edwards-Helaire and Cam Akers, maybe Zach Moss, those are guys that I think could be the 40% to Devin Singletary's 60% in a modern backfield where Singletary is still the primary guy, but you're not taking his 5'7", 200 pounds and turning him into Ezekiel Elliott's 30 touches a game.
Well, no.
That's where the modern backfield would be. And if one of them make it to the 3rd round, I think that's actually a sweet spot to snag one of those guys. Otherwise, anyone, I'd rather get a UDFA because any of the rest of the guys, I don't think there's any difference makers.
I mean, I saw those running backs, just the sheer volume of them, and I was like, okay, what the hell are we doing here? But
every NFL team needs 6 running backs.
Exactly. Why not? Just running backs. In fact, we'll just have the all running back offense. Why not? It'll be great. We'll put them out as wide receivers. No one will ever know what we're doing. Yeah. A.J. Dillon would make I was just talking about needing better blocking from the slot. Maybe that's A.J. Dillon's role.
I think one of those guys could make sense, maybe not 3 of them.
So ultimately, we get to the end of this. Now, I want to pull this up and talk because we talk about the different picks you make and the shakeup that you've done in terms of the overall structure of the roster. I'm looking at it. It's up in front of me. Now, you've just sold out in this fantasy scenario. So let's take it offensive side of the ball first. Do you believe, looking at the bodies that you would be carrying at this point into the offseason, that is an offense that could go win a Super Bowl?
So I've made this point a lot internally. I think that there is a genuine chance for Brandon Beane to build the deepest and most talented roster that Bills fans have seen in 25 years, because we have a pocket where you're bringing back almost everyone. You have a lot of guys on cheap rookie deals, and you're still able to add a whole nother draft class and another free agent group before any of the monster contracts come up. And all of that combined is 50% of our potential, and the other 50% is purely Josh Allen and whether he takes a material step forward to capitalize on what I think already was pretty darn good talent, and now adds multiple other pieces to maximize where those guys are at. So in the process that I'm assuming we see that, and that he does take that step forward, I genuinely think so. I think that you've now added dynamic playmakers in a couple different spots. You've added depth everywhere to be able to survive an injury or two. And that if we're going forward with the idea that even if Josh got hurt, we'd still have talent there, but that he's ready to take that step forward, maintain any of the progress he made in the intermediary, add accuracy on the deep ball, and that now you have weapons that can go get those deep balls. I do think that they could do that. And I think that with what we'll get to in the second part here, which I believe is a historically dominant defense of what I built, I think the offense only needs to be above average, and I think they can be above average.
I mean, and I guess this is where when I look at it and I'm looking at holes, and I'm just looking at where I think weaknesses of this thing may be. I mean, you've addressed depth at a lot of different positions. I look at that offensive line and I say, I feel like somehow we'd be walking into this season. We just got done calling Spencer Long a luxury, but it felt good. It felt good knowing that for the first time in a long time, Bills fans can remember. Yeah, I've been a season ticket holder for almost 10 years now. And I can recall years where you're sitting in the stands and somebody goes down with an injury and you see a player get helped off. And you see some guy come out on the field and you're like, wait a minute, I have to pull my phone out and Google who the hell this person is because I don't know. Yeah. I don't even know who that guy is because he's our third stringer because that was our backup. With this team, the strength last year was that our offensive line could figure out injuries. They could figure out, they shuffled some things around. They managed Cody Ford's ineffectiveness at times at right tackle. I mean, one of the biggest things that speaks to the need, I mean, we talked about it in this week's podcast, going and needs to upgrade on the offensive line or on the offense as a whole. You look at that right tackle spot, even in the penultimate game of their season, the finale, this isn't the final, we don't think, but it could be if we don't go into Houston and win. You've seen an entire season of Cody Ford at right tackle. And yet in the game that matters most, you still gave him a 51 to 49% snap split with Tyenseki. You still didn't trust him to hold the job 100% of the time. That tells me more about what they think of him than anything else. Yeah. So with that, now you've turned our right tackle spot into Brian Bulaga, an older veteran who hopefully can stay healthy. Your depth is Adrian Waddell and Tyenseki, one of whom has a history of injuries and one of whom is coming off of one of his own.
Yep. That
makes me incredibly nervous. Looking at just the status of that line with there's no Matt Pert you have added here, which if people go read the article, they'll figure out how he gets on the roster. But I don't see youth with upside, and I don't see who could be groomed for the future after this. After this just absolute, I don't even want to know what you want to call it, opening of the vault, if you will. There's nothing for the future there, and there's also nothing to protect you against injury.
Yeah, so I would say, obviously, having Nsekhe and Waddle not in starting positions, you'd like to think that they'd be able to step in and play as needed if that comes up. But I do think it underrated. I was actually really disappointed to see Jeremiah Searles retire. I was kind of excited to have him back. I think that people got really excited about Ryan Bates, and I said, Jeremiah Searles is what everybody thinks Ryan Bates was supposed to be because everybody loves, but Ryan Bates can play 5 positions. Yeah, none of them well. None of them at an NFL caliber level. But yeah, I mean, it is kind of neat that he can do all 5 of them. Jeremiah Searles could actually play all 5 at an NFL roster level, not an NFL starter level, but at a NFL roster worthy level. So I was a little sad when he announced his retirement. I was kind of secretly planning on him being that 9th lineman because he could plug in anywhere that's there.
See, one of my coworkers came up to me at work and they were like, because I'm the Bills guy in the office. I'm the football guy. So people seek me out whenever they have a football, just, hey, I want to ask a quick question, or hey, what do you think about this? And someone comes up to me and goes, oh, hey, so what do you think about this Ryan Bates? And I'm like, what is that? What is
a Ryan Bates?
What is a Ryan Bates? I don't know what you're talking about. And then at some point during the season, so I remember somebody at work asking me about him, and I was like, "Are we still doing that? Are we still doing that thing, the Ryan Bates thing?"
He was undrafted for a reason.
So switching gears and looking at the defensive side of the ball. The defensive end position, now that's something that Sean McDermott as a defensive coordinator would have an absolute hard on for.
Oh, it's glorious.
That's
the combination for anyone who isn't seeing it, it's Yannick Ngakoue, Jerry Hughes, Mario Addison, and Yetur Gross-Matos as the top four. You would just rotate over and over again and just horrify quarterbacks. It's great.
But see, here's one thing that I like about a setup like that, and I think it's something, and this is why when I say that it's not outlandish to see the Bills maybe kicking the tires on an Ngakoue trade of some kind. Having a Jerry Hughes, a Yannick Ngakoue, and what I'm assuming is going to be somewhere in the top 90 picks, another developmental pass rusher.
Agreed.
One of the things that you see some of the most successful defensive lines doing is some teams call it the NASCAR package. Some teams, they have different nicknames for it. But it's where you put multiple defensive ends on the interior of the line and the exterior, and you line everybody up, and your smaller, faster interior guys, that it's going to cause problems is what it's going to do, because their speed and their get off is going to be more than those interior guys are used to dealing with.
And one of your defensive tackles is Ed Oliver as well, to mix in that.
Exactly. So now you're talking about them being able to rotate three defensive ends of the caliber of a young rookie with upside, a Jerry Hughes and an Ngakoue. Picture Jerry Hughes being able to take on right tackles.
Yeah.
Just right tackles. And then you might be able to put him over center sometimes. And it's just going to cause havoc. You can't do that with our current alignment. And you haven't been able to do that for years because our defensive line just wasn't talented enough. That's something I like about the setup that I'm seeing here. I also like the fact that people hate Star Lotulelei, but when I look at this, what you've done with the inclusion of Vernon Butler, Harrison Phillips coming off that ACL tear is not a guarantee.
Yeah, everyone's hopeful.
This isn't Madden.
There's potential there, but yeah, there's no guarantee.
So the fact that you have a guy like Vernon Butler, who, like you said, he's built like a boy, he's built like a one tack, but he plays like a three. You can have him come in and do some of the things that Phillips was doing for you before he went out. He could do some of the things that Star Lotulelei might be asked to do at least a reasonable enough level that he can be a healthy part of your rotation. I mean, Ed Oliver's the star. Everybody else just has to rotate around him. But I think that's a really nice looking D tackle room. Ultimately, the defense as a whole, I think that's probably the thing I like most about this setup that you have here.
My approach was, people always talk about, you already have a strength there, so let's focus on the other side of that. And I often think, if you can make a strength dominantly elite, you take the pressure off the other side of that, rather than assuming we can go from average or slightly below average on offense to all of a sudden elite. That's an unreasonable jump. I think it's actually more reasonable to say, hey, could we take what was, intermittently the third or fifth best defense in the league to be, hey, this is a special unit that wins games, and hey, they're not giving up more than 2 touchdowns ever in being able to go through there, in that you still have the entire back seven still available and under contract. If you were to go after one of the names we didn't talk about, adding to Chris Harris, in that, hey, do we make a material upgrade opposite of Trey White, where it's not anyone that can be picked on or that you're going to go after, and is a elite level slot receiver or slot corner when you move into the three corner package. That kind of flexibility, when you put a actual difference making pass rush in front of them, that combination, I think it has such a, not just a step forward, but you're talking about a transformational leap forward in what it can do, because we've put together great defense for the past couple of years with no difference maker from a pass rush standpoint. It's all been scheme and, playing together and making the most of the situation, and Jerry Hughes being pretty good and above average.
You could argue the secondary made the front seven as effective as it has been.
Absolutely. I think that's absolutely the case.
Where a lot of the great defenses that you've seen this year, like even the San Francisco 49ers and that defense that was so highly touted, their front seven is the reason that their secondary was so good.
Agreed.
And you saw that get ultimately exposed in the Super Bowl. That was their undoing, was that those guys just couldn't cover well enough to get the job done at the end of the day. So ultimately, I like what I'm seeing here. I really do at the end of the day. I didn't like how you got here. Sometimes there was times I wanted to pick up as I'm reading this for the first time, and I wanted to pick up my phone and just start messaging you. And I was like, no, don't do it. Don't do it. Let's see this thing through. Because it's like complaining about a movie before you figured out how it ended. But so now that we're here at the end, you as the GM who has just put yourself in the hot seat by doing the thing no one would do. You've spent it all. You've given it all away. All your draft capital, you burned it up. Let's say the Bills do all of this, and in 2020, they bring home a Lombardi trophy. The party is on, okay? And we're going to assume that the party doesn't actually force the entire population to have to permanently relocate because they've left the city in shambles.
Because they burned it down to rubble.
It's just a mess. We're talking like Fallout 3 kind of a thing here. You're going into a season in 2021 where your future's already been heavily leveraged. You probably have to make moves just to get under the salary cap. Major cuts have to take place. You're making decisions, and you're a team that would almost certainly regress as we got closer to having to pay Josh Allen fair market value to play quarterback. So with that, you're going to see a rapid deterioration of this roster that you've assembled. I already know how I would answer this question, but if the Bills won it all on the back of a plan like you've laid out here in your article, how many years do you think it takes? How many years do you think Bills fans have in them after that Super Bowl win? I'm looking at Philadelphia, a city that did nothing but carp about how they couldn't win.
Yeah.
They complained constantly about how, we can't win the big one. And then they won it. Not only did they win it, but they did it. I mean, I have that recorded. And because, again, folks, our brand is that we are the pettiest Bills podcast in existence. I have that Super Bowl recorded, Eagles, Patriots, and I will go back and watch it sometimes. I will rewatch it at like 10:30 when I get home from the bar and I have a good buzz and I'm like, I'm not ready for bed and I just want something to go. I'm going to go out on a high note. I know I'll rewatch Tom Brady lose the Super Bowl again.
That's
yes.
awesome.
And yet at the same time, those same fans who were so starved for a Lombardi, they got it. And then even last season, I saw Doug Peterson's not very good and, this team stinks. How soon do you think Bills fans, how many seasons do you think you could blow after this type of an exercise, you win a Super Bowl, how long do you think it takes?
So I think there's a lot of corollaries with the Eagles. I think the same thing with the Red Sox breaking their curse, with the Cubs breaking their curse, with a lot of those long-suffering situations. I think there's a substantial amount of goodwill that would be won with that, in that no matter what, it would be a lesser degree of vitriol than what we're conditioned to now, what we're seeing today with the Sabres, and what you're seeing with that kind of, how ravenous it gets in some of those nasty times and the ends of ugly Bill seasons. That one, I don't think it would fall off to that degree, but let's say it did. Let's say it really fell out, the wheels fell off. It was, hey, we had to make 3 or 4 ugly cuts, and then we had a nasty rash of injuries, and we went from Super Bowl to 5-11, and a painful 5-11. I think obviously you're going to have plenty of the "what have you done for me lately" crowd. You're going to have plenty of bandwagon fans who only jumped on because of the Super Bowl run and are now bad-mouthing things that they're just uninformed on. But I still think it would be different. I still think it would be different enough that there would be plenty of time into that second, into that third season, that just getting a championship, the "give me one before I die," that entire spiel, I think it would have satisfied so much of getting over that hump that even though we'd find a way to get bitter and frustrated and jaded again, it wouldn't be the same level, just because getting over that hump you'd carry so much for it. And I think it would come in the sense of, you talked about it there, you had a couple guys start to snipe at Doug Peterson, but there's no real momentum for that. And I think it'd be the same way if McDermott and Bean found a way to bring a title to Buffalo. I don't think it's a lifetime contract, but they've got a lot of rope to be able to go on another 5-year run after that before it actually got to the point where they would really have to fall apart to have it be called for their heads.
That's fair, especially considering it would be your name on it. So,
yeah,
especially considering it would be Greg Thompson.
Yes, yeah, clearly. But thank you.
I'd be walking around waiting to see banners of just, the people be calling for the billboard on the 90 with your face on it saying "Fire Greg Thompson." And it's like, oh man, it's happening.
Yeah, I can't believe it's come full circle this quickly. But I would just cuddle at night with my Lombardi trophy, and everything would be all right. But thank you, Drew. This is exactly what I was hoping for. I wanted someone to take me to task for the outlandish things that I put together here. For the folks that are listening, I'm actually going through this and say, okay, now that I did a ridiculous version, here's actually a version of what I think Brandon Beane is going to do. So that'll be coming up here in the next week with a lot more players re-signed, a lot more of the current roster retained, a little less fortunate draft in our lap. A lot less big picture stuff, and preparing ourselves that they're looking to roll over some cap money to prepare for what we need to be thankful for the fact of they've drafted really, really well. We're hitting on a higher proportion than what most teams do, and that may not continue forever. We may not continue to hit at the rate that we're hitting at, but we have for 3 drafts in a row now, which means we have more than the average amount of extensions coming up for players we want to pay, because drafting well is great, but it only matters if you retain them. And I think there is going to be a very strategic appetite to set aside 30 or 40 of that $85 million to be set aside for future use. So thank you. Drew, any final things? For anyone, who hasn't checked it out already, I know many of you guys are already faithful listeners. If you haven't, check out the Rockpile Report. You can see it everywhere that your podcasts are available. Fantastic work. I know Drew is the star of the show. Chris does an awesome job, though. Really great contributor, producer of the show. And
what Chris does best? Chris's role on our podcast has grown over the years. Because before he was happy just being the silent guy behind the microphone, and it was hard being one guy just talking to himself for an hour. Now Chris has become not just like a conversation piece for the show, but he's really learned how to take shots at me during the show.
Which everyone enjoys.
Which everyone gets a kick out of. Now, our show, we this past week we had Matt Perino from New York Upstate. He's been on your show before. He came on and did the we break it down into 2 parts. We focused on offense this past week, breaking down the various free agent groups, the classes, the makeup of those classes, what makes sense for the Bills. This next week, we're going to have the other half of New York Upstate's team, Ryan Talbot. He's going to join us, and we're just going to be talking about the defensive side of the football. And it's, we're going to talk about this defensive tackle group and Vernon Butler and how I think that there's some guys out there that no one's really thinking about that might be solid fits, because there's so many people worried about what we're losing, because that's been the backbone of this team. I mean, the defense really has been. And I think for us to be competitive next year, it's going to have to be again, because I think that you're talking about a team that in the run up to the draft is going to focus a lot of its draft capital on improving that offensive side of the football, because ultimately that's where so much money gets spent. Yep. Quarterback, offensive line, wide receiver. I think there's more big money positions on that side of the ball. And for that reason, if you're going to swing for the fences in the draft, you do it on that side of the ball versus continually pouring major assets into your defense, because even the best defenses can't win you a Super Bowl if you don't score more than 21 points.
Yep.
That's it.
We just saw it.
And then you want to talk about your draft stuff. I hate mock drafts, which is why our podcast for the next month and a half, it's nothing but experts. Russ Brown from Cover One, he's he's our annual offensive line guru. I know nothing about the draft, people. I hate everything about it. I think I'm right. And then afterwards, I've hated every pick that the Bills have hit right. Trey White, I didn't think that pick was very good. I didn't like the Devin Singletary pick. And I've loved the picks that haven't panned out.
I like Tanner Vallejo more than Matt Milano.
Exactly. So with that said, I'm very good at whiffing on these things, so we don't even try to pretend that we know what we're talking about. Instead, we spend the next month and a half bringing in specialists, guys like Matt Waldman, guys like Russ Brown, people from the draft community who really know what they're talking about, so that they can educate me and our listeners on the various position groups in the draft. It's a lot of fun. I appreciate you having me on tonight, and I don't know. We need to do this again sometime.
No, absolutely. It was just a great time. I knew you were the right person to be able to come on and have some fun with. Again, for anybody who hasn't checked it out, make sure you're listening to the Rockpile Report. It's an awesome time. Drew, you were fantastic tonight. Everything I was hoping for. Thank you guys for the chat. Thank you, everybody that's been listening along. You've been listening to Cover One Buffalo, and we are out.